All right, speaking of the Equality Act, this creates an uneven playing field, literally. The legislation would classify men who identify as women as biological females who can legally dominate women's sports with no repercussions. I mean, they can use women's locker rooms, but that isn't all. The Equality Act also takes aim at religious freedom, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But in the 2 months of the Biden administration that they've been in place, we're already seeing a crisis of historic proportions at the southern border. Now take a listen to what Ambassador Roberta Jacobson, coordinator of the southern border, had to say about this historic surge.
Surges tend to respond to hope, and there was a significant hope for a more humane policy after 4 years of pent-up demand. So I don't know whether I would call that a coincidence, but I certainly think that the idea that a more humane policy would be in place may have driven people to make that decision.
A humane policy of not enforcing the law that has resulted in a record number of unaccompanied minors making as young as 6 and 7 years old, coming across the border by themselves. You call that humane? Joining me now to talk about all of this is U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee. Senator, welcome back to the program.
I am so pleased to join you, and I tell you, this humanitarian crisis at the southern border is heartbreaking. When you think about these children that are being put in the care of coyotes and cartels and brought to that border, they're being abused along the way. Some of them end up in labor gangs and human trafficking and sex trafficking rings. Some of them are going into different types of gangs, violence, drug trafficking. And it is heartbreaking that these young people, these children, are facing this as their life and what they're going to experience. So that, in my book, is not humane treatment.
Well, and this is a crisis, but it's a crisis of this administration's own making.
Yes, you're exactly right. President Trump had some provisions in place that I think that should have remained. Had the Biden administration done nothing, if they had kept the Trump administration asylum policy, if you claim asylum, go back to your country, and we will deal with the asylum issue, or the Remain in Mexico policy, they were never brought here, or the migrant protection protocols. Those are things that should have been left in place. They were not. Basically, they ripped those up, and just like Pelosi ripped apart that State of the Union speech last year, and they threw those away. And Tony, now what you have is an absolute mess, because people have interpreted, whether it is the cartels, the coyotes, or people in Central American countries, plus you look at what's happening with people from China, from the Middle East, that are paying tens of thousands of dollars to the cartels to come into the United States.
Yeah, it's horrific what is happening. I'm going to talk more about that next segment with Congressman Michael Cloud. I was there after the Trump protocols were put in place, and it looked like a ghost town. Hardly anything was happening. That's not the case now. I want to move on, Senator, to something you've been leading out on, and rightfully so, because it is an attack on women. It's an attack on women in many ways. A lot of the issues, or a lot of the focus, rather, has been on the sports aspect. But the Equality Act attacks womanhood in a variety of ways, and that's not all it attacks.
Well, you're right about that, and it is of tremendous concern to us when you look at what is happening with women and their push for equality. You can go back 100 years to when women were fighting for the right to vote, and how they have pushed to reach equality. And now, under this Equality Act, it is anything but equality, because it will give biological males who identify as females the right to compete in sports, the right to compete for scholarships, the right to compete through extracurricular activities, to vie for placement in programs or in universities. They will be competing against women. And also, whether it is a domestic abuse shelter or a prison, what you will have is biological males who identify as female will have to be invited into those shelters as a female.
So, Senator Blackburn, you've been very outspoken on this. You've also been very outspoken on the fundamental First Amendment freedoms that we have, of freedom of speech and freedom of worship, the freedom of religion. Those, believe it or not, get caught up in this Equality Act.
Oh, absolutely they do. Because what you would see with this is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is something you were for. It would be overridden by the provisions that are there in the Equality Act. And you know, Tony, I believe that everyone, every American should be treated equally. They're guaranteed in the Constitution the right to be treated equally.
Mm-hmm. Nobody
in this country is above the law. Nobody should receive preferential treatment from the law. But instead of establishing equal rights, what this does is to preference individuals who are a biological male who choose to identify as female.
Now, there's something that stands in the way. It passed the House. It's now over in the Senate. It is a legislative measure that will require a 60-vote threshold to move to a vote on the bill. That's called the filibuster. So the filibuster kind of stands in the way. Does this put the filibuster at risk in the Senate because of how much emphasis the left has put on policies like the Equality Act?
Well, of course, the left is going full steam ahead with their agenda. They are trying to ramrod this agenda through because they know they're going to lose the House and the Senate in 2022, if not before. And so they are pushing as hard as they can to get these provisions through, whether it was the American Rescue Act, their COVID relief bill, which didn't have a whole lot to do with COVID.
Right.
91% of the bill had to do with other than COVID or COVID vaccines or distribution or getting shots in arms. They also have the PRO Act, which would do away with right-to-work states. They have two bills that would infringe on your Second Amendment rights and require background checks, even if you want to give a firearm to your brother or your son or your daughter. They are trying to push forward with this Equality Act to preference individuals from the LGBTQ community. And I just find it really sad that this is where and I have to tell you, Tony, I've got a lot of friends who are independents and Democrats, and they are stunned, absolutely stunned, that Joe Biden, who they thought was going to be a moderate, has done a pivot and has taken up and agreed with these far left issues that the Democrat leadership is pushing.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. So, Senator Marsha Blackburn, what should our listeners be doing when it comes to the Equality Act and some of these other radical policies they're pushing?
Well, first of all, they need to be praying for mercy for this country. And then they should also contact Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, two Democrats who have said that they will continue to support the filibuster. They need to encourage them. If they live in a state with a Democratic senator, they need to call that senator's office and register their opposition.
Yeah. Good advice, and we will certainly encourage all of our listeners to do that. Senator Marsha Blackburn, as always, great to talk with you. Thanks so much for stopping by today.